where they come from and how they got here. Now this area is just an extension of the Hawaiian village, and because we're in Hawaii, we're also going to focus in on the people of Hawaii, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my ancestors and what their beliefs are as far as the origin of the Hawaiian people. Now ultimately that's going to involve this canoe that you see behind me, and the name of the canoe is Iosepa. And so as you look at your map, you might be wondering where Iosepa is, but really it's just the name of the canoe. So it doesn't represent any island in particular. Okay, first off, what we have here is a map of the Pacific Ocean, and as you know, it's the largest body of water in the world, covering 1/3 of the Earth's surface. Now it's so large that if we were to take all of the continents in the world and put them into the Pacific Ocean, there'd still be enough room for another continent the size of Asia. So it's quite large. However, instead of continents, we have hundreds and thousands of tiny little islands. And most of these islands sort of existed as their own island kingdoms prior to Western contact. Now, when European explorers and sailors started coming over to this side of the world, they noticed the similarities within the cultures and the languages of each of these people. And so they sort of they kind of divided us up into 3 main groups. And so we have Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Does anyone know what the word Nesia means? Islands? Good. It's a Greek word meaning islands. So the word before it describes what kind of islands they are. Now we'll start off with Micronesia. Micro meaning small. And these are islands, the islands of Palau, Guam, Satawal, Chuuk, and so forth. These islands are tiny. They go from a 0.6 square miles. Those are the smaller islands. And the larger ones are about 3 to 4 miles wide, with hundreds of people living on them. And people have always lived there. And so we like to think of the people of Micronesia as very resourceful, very hardworking. And you have to be if you're going to live on a small little tiny island in the middle of the largest ocean in the world with limited resources. Now the people of Micronesia are believed to have come from Southeast Asia. Okay, then we move down to Melanesia. Anyone know what mela means? You'll hear it in words like melanin, melatonin. Okay, it refers to the pigmentation in your skin. And so we have dark or black islands. Now, it was given this name because the vegetation there is very lush and very dense. And so whether you're sailing in or flying in, from a distance, the islands will appear darker. The people of Melanesia also have the darker skin tones, darker than the rest of us here in the Pacific. Now, the people of Melanesia are believed to have come from Australia. About 20,000 years ago, the water levels were so low that these were not islands at all, but just extensions of the Australian continent. And so people traveled back and forth between these 2 parts through land bridges. When the water levels rose, the higher parts, which were the mountains, became islands. And so that's why the vegetation there grows very close together. It's a continental island. Okay, now for that reason, anthropologists also believe that the people of Melanesia are descendants of the early Aborigines of Australia. Okay, then we move on to Polynesia. Poly meaning many. Does anyone know how many islands there are in Polynesia? Many. Okay, let's start off here in Hawaii. Here in Hawaii, we have our 8 major islands. Far past the northern of the 8 is the rest of the Hawaiian archipelago, which includes the Midway Islands. And so just to give you an idea, here in Hawaii alone, we have over 130 islands. Fiji all by themselves has over 300 islands. And so altogether, we have a little over 2,400 islands. Okay, just in Polynesia. Now you might have heard of the Polynesian Triangle. It goes from Hawaii down to Aotearoa or New Zealand, over to Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and then back up to Hawaii. And that sort of creates the boundaries. All of the islands within this triangle are considered to be part of Polynesia, with the exception of Fiji. Now on a better map, you'll notice that Fiji sits right outside the boundaries. However, because of cultural similarities, like to group them in with us. And so that's why you'll see them here at the center today. But as you go to the Fiji village, you'll also notice that they do have the darker skin tones, which is a characteristic of the people of Melanesia. Now, the big question that everyone has is, where did all these people come from? 80% of the islands here in Polynesia are populated. And so that's a lot of people. The question is, did we all come from the same place? Or did people from all parts of the world just sort of find their way to these islands here? According to anthropologists, we all came from the same place, and that's Southeast Asia. Now, they thought it'd be easier for us to sort of dot our way or island hop through the Pacific Ocean, coming first to the heart of Polynesia, which would be Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and then branch out to the outer extremities of the triangle. And this, they believe, is how Polynesia was settled. They also have physical evidence, such as the starches, the plants and animals that we have here in our islands. Those things can be traced back to this side of the world. And so for the most part, it's a very logical explanation, very reasonable. There's a lot of evidence that points to this. However, when you ask the people of Polynesia where their ancestors came from, the answer is a little bit different. Okay, so we're going to talk about that a bit. Now, as I mentioned before, because we're in the Hawaiian village, we're just going to focus in on Hawaii, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my ancestors. However, because you're in the center today, you don't have to go thousands of miles to New Zealand. All you have to do is go right down the path. And so I actually recommend talking to the natives there and finding out what kind of interesting stories that they might have. But for us here in Hawaii, prior to Western contact, we didn't have a written language. We lived in what you would call an oral society, and so we didn't have history books or records or tablets or anything like that. We had songs, chants, and dances. And if you're familiar with the hula, you'll know that hula is our form of dance. Not only that, but it was the way in which our ancestors were able to pass these stories down for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it was in the hula, it was in our songs, and it was in our chants that you'll find the history of our people. Now, as we go through the history of the Hawaiian people, we will find that the Hawaiians believe that their ancestors came from Kahikiku. And this isn't just a name that you'll find in one of our chants. It actually appears in hundreds of them. Kahikiku. And so where is Kahiki? Now, when we look at the map, especially Polynesians, oftentimes will think of Tahiti. Kahiki, Tahiti. Sounds the same. Because of the similarities within our languages, oftentimes all you need to do is just interchange a couple of letters and it'll mean the same thing with the same definition, but in several different Polynesian languages. So from Kahiki, it's very possible that we might mean Tahiti. However, traditionally, Kahiki was also a direction, points to the rising of the sun. And everyone knows that the sun rises in the east. Okay, now what's east of Hawaii? The American continent. And so it's kind of a big contrast from what anthropologists believe. Now, what evidence do we have that supports this? Now, scientifically speaking, not much evidence. Geographically speaking, however, Hawaii is the most isolated group of islands in the world. And so you'd need to travel at least 2,300 miles from here to get to the closest landmass. And that's pretty far. Now, the closest landmass to Hawaii is actually San Francisco, California. And so we're a lot closer to the Americas than we are to the rest of our cousins here in the Pacific. Also, in recent years, they've done some blood or DNA testing, and it turns out that in the islands of Micronesia, their blood type is predominantly A. In Melanesia, they are predominantly B, which could actually link them as far back as Africa. Now here in southern Polynesia, where most of our cousins lie, they're a combination of both. However, here in Hawaii, and we're the only Polynesian island north of the equator, we're O positive. And so we're quite different from the rest of our cousins in the Pacific. Now the question that we get quite often is, if Hawaii is the most isolated group of islands in the world, how did anyone find it in the first place? Now, in the stories of our ancestors, it tells us that hundreds of years ago, they stood on the shores, looked out over the ocean, and saw a star. Has anyone heard of people following stars? Hundreds of years ago, a lot of civilizations did. Now, the Hawaiians were no different. Interestingly enough, sitting directly over the islands of Hawaii is the brightest star north of the equator. Our ancestors had a name for it. They called it Hokulea. Astronomers today call that same star formation, or that zenith star, Arcturus. And it's the fourth brightest star in the sky. However, in the northern hemisphere, it's the brightest. And so according to the stories that our ancestors have been passing down, by following this star formation on a clear night, sailing west with the wind at your back, it's actually quite easy to end up in our islands of Hawaii. Easy. Okay, 2,300 miles now. Now, of course, during the daytime, you can't see the stars, and so the Polynesians, or the early Hawaiians, developed a very complex, very intricate system of navigation. They used migratory birds, which would fly from the northern areas down to the warmer islands during the winter months. They kept a record of all the different ocean currents, the names they had for it, cloud formations, and different wind patterns. And so for hundreds of years, they were able to develop this system of navigation. Now, in the early 1970s, a group of Hawaiians, as well as professors from the University of Hawaii, formed what we call today the Polynesian Voyaging Society. And they wanted to test out all these different theories, because at that time, anthropologists started coming in and telling people, this is where you guys came from, which kind of conflicted with our oral history. So they constructed a canoe similar to the one that you see behind me, and they named the canoe Hokulea, after the name of our zenith star. Now, they sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti, and on their very first attempt, they did so without a compass, without a sextant. They didn't even have an escort boat. All they had was the information that was passed down to them from our ancestors. And in 31 days, they hit the islands of Tahiti dead on, which is a pretty impressive feat considering the fact that during Captain Cook's time, it would take him about 60 days to make that same trip in his steamboat. Now, since that time, other canoes have been built, including the one that you see behind me. This one, as I mentioned before, is named Iosepa, and Iosepa means Joseph. Now, this was constructed as part of the Hawaiian Studies program over at BYU Hawaii, which is the university right next door. And if students are interested in learning more about celestial navigation or Polynesian wayfinding, we actually have a couple of courses that they can take. It goes from the fall, winter, even through spring. And every spring they go out and they sail around the neighbor islands. Because it belongs to Hawaii, the canoe does not leave Hawaiian waters. But other canoes that have been built have been able to sail from Hawaii down to New Zealand, over to the Galapagos, and the west coast of the Americas, even as far as Japan. And so in the coming year, that first canoe that made that trip in the 1970s is actually planning a world tour. And so they're going to circle the globe using nothing but the Polynesian navigation. And it's a trip that they say will take about 2 to 3 years. So imagine being on a canoe for that long. Not very many people can do that, but that's the reason why canoes like these are very important to us. It connects us to our past and to the intelligence of our ancestors. Now, this sort of brings us to the end of our presentation, but before you go, we invite you to take a look around. From the nail prints to the patches, you'll notice that it's made purely out of natural materials. We also have 2 different videos which talk a little bit more about this canoe. And if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to come up and ask.